You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda.
And this is Prashant Parmeswaran from Washington, D.C.
Hey Prashant, how are you doing today?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. So President Donald Trump is back from Asia. He has wrapped up his first trip to the region. We, on the last episode of this podcast, covered part one, which looked at his time in Tokyo and Seoul, the two big Northeast Asian allies of the United States, where I think we had a fairly sanguine assessment overall that he was mostly successful in the reassurance task, even if there were a few moments of strange optics. But on this episode, let's get to the rest of the trip, which I think is also a mixed bag. He went to China, where he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, discussed a range of regional, bilateral, and global issues. From there, he traveled to Vietnam, where he participated in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, APEC, and delivered a major speech on the theme of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which we've hinted at previously on this podcast. And he attended a bilateral summit with the Vietnamese. And following that, he ended up in Manila for the ASEAN Summit. ASEAN was celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, the 40th anniversary of U.S.-ASEAN ties. And he also had a bilateral meeting with President Rodrigo Duterte, and at the end of the day, he did not end up staying for the plenary session of the East Asia Summit after things ran behind schedule, and he ended up leaving Asia slightly earlier. So there's a lot to talk about here, and I'll also add that we'll also maybe talk a bit about the much discussed meeting of the Quadrilateral, which I think is getting interest in some countries more than others. Certainly India is giving quite a bit of attention to this. It was front page headlines after this meeting. But let's start off in China, Prashant. This was obviously a highly anticipated stop on this trip. The U.S.-China relationship continues to remain the most important bilateral in many ways for the United States in the Asia-Pacific, just given the uncertainties involved and as China becomes increasingly ambitious and less shy about showing its ambition. Certainly after the 19th Party Congress, that's more than apparent given Chinese President Xi Jinping's clarity about where China's headed in the world. But I wanted to sort of get your 30,000-foot review of his trip in China. How well do you think Trump did in terms of not only pursuing U.S. interests, but also just generally dealing with some of the more difficult questions when it comes to the relationship with China, including North Korea, South China Sea, the regional security architecture. How do you think Trump did in Beijing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, going back to the theme that we did the last podcast we talked about, which is, expectations for this trip overall were quite low. And I think that applies on the China trip as well, because you had a position where President Trump was going to China with his domestic position quite weakened and uncertain. And also a lot of U.S. policy in the Asia Pacific was still kind of being built, whereas Xi Jinping was coming out from a party congress having consolidated his power, and China's initiatives in the Asia Pacific with respect to One Belt, One Road, a lot of that architecture has already been built and is still there. So he did have that dynamic to negotiate. Not many people were hoping for much in terms of substance, and we didn't get a lot of that. We saw them talk about North Korea. We saw them mention some stuff in the way of trade and sort of the regional and global order, but not any significance in terms of specifics. And I would say that would kind of be the worry for the rest of the Asian states who are looking at this, because I think when people were looking at the trip initially, they were worried that the Chinese were trying to woo Trump with this sort of state plus visit, and that he might sort of fall for that, and we could see more of this sort of U.S. China first Asia policy, right, where Trump would be kind of softer on China and not really sort of built out or seek to alienate Beijing. I don't know if we can say for certain whether that's what happened, but I think those fears and uncertainties are still there because we haven't had much of the substance of U.S. policy built out. I think what some folks are hoping is that we will see a stronger and tougher U.S. policy once he gets back, and we see this administration become more of a traditional Republican administration that's tough on security issues. But we haven't seen that to date yet. So still a lot of uncertainty, I think, on the China question. And as we've talked about before, for Southeast Asian countries and other Asian states, they're really looking to the U.S.-China relationship to see what the indications are there to then see what are the implications for them. So the fact that we have uncertainty on this, even if though we're still early in the administration, I think remains a point of concern.
Right. I think you pinpointed an important point that stuck out from this trip, which is that anxiety among middle powers in Asia, but also smaller states in Southeast Asia about that so-called, China first approach to Asia, the old idea of a G2, where great power diplomacy between the United States and China ends up dwarfing all other priorities in Asia. And with Trump, it's always been an open question. You've had this struggle inside the administration between the doves and the hawks when it comes to China, and increasingly it looks as if the doves are at least maintaining greater numbers at higher levels of the administration. Certainly, Trump tends to trust many of the doves that are still in the administration. Most notable probably being, his son-in-law and daughter, Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, who have quite a good rapport with China. And someone like Peter Navarro, who is probably the biggest hawk in the administration, he was actually left back in D.C. for this trip. And I think you saw a lot of that play out along with what Trump ended up actually saying. I mean, his remarks on trade, which you briefly alluded to, I thought were illuminating. He did point out the massive trade deficit that the United States has with China, but the attribution for that deficit was interesting. He did not, he specifically said, "I don't blame China. I mean, any country would take advantage of this." And he might have been right in that sense, but then he, in Beijing, in the Great Hall of the People, he blames his predecessors for allowing China to take advantage of the United States, almost as if he was back just in the United States at a campaign rally. And the optics of that, I have to say, weren't great, especially when you consider the broader message on multilateral, robust, liberalized trade that Trump delivered in other destinations on this trip, including in Vietnam. But definitely, I think the Chinese succeeded in managing the optics of this trip as one, again, demonstrating a good personal relationship between Xi and Trump. And I think Trump really played that up. Reportedly on Air Force One, he told reporters that he felt respected by Xi and he will always value a relationship built on respect more than a relationship built on friendship. And I don't know if that was a conscious attempt by Trump to maybe take a snide stab at, Abe and Moon, who seem to be really playing up the friendship angle. Abe's been really trying to develop that interpersonal relationship, the golfing and everything. But with
Right.
Xi, it seems like, Trump's really been reciprocating. And also, this is going to sound ridiculous, but in 2017, it's really an important mode of analysis. He changed his cover photo on Twitter after he left China to show, him and Xi Jinping and Melania Trump and Peng Liyuan, standing there. He didn't do that for Abe and Moon. I thought the optics of that again were somewhat notable. Overall, it does seem that Trump has taken a liking to Xi Jinping. He sees a leader who appears to be strong. He's been congratulating him on Twitter. So I think that unease around this idea of a G2 or a China first approach to Asia isn't going to be entirely evaporated after this trip. If anything, it's going to be more of a concern, I think, heading into 2018. But again, I wrote about this for the South China Morning Post, and I think there is really a possibility that bureaucratic forces, and I think there's evidence of this, especially at the National Security Council level and elsewhere in the White House, might ultimately succeed in shifting the tide of U.S. policy. That even if at the presidential level Xi and Trump maintain a good rapport, U.S. policy may finally come to start hitting on some of those more difficult questions that matter to this administration, including the trade deficit, including the South China Sea. Shall we move on now to the next destination on this trip, which was Vietnam? So I guess let's start by talking about the APEC summit. The minute I heard that Trump would be going to an APEC summit, I was already worried because I think everything that Trump has embodied, when it comes to international economics and trade, is essentially the antithesis of what APEC stands for. APEC is it's a body for consultation on free and liberalized trade in the Asia-Pacific region, which is something that Trump has explicitly rejected. And he took the opportunity to again make this clear at APEC. But Prashant, I do want to talk about this speech that we alluded to earlier on this podcast and in previous episodes, where Trump addressed finally this theme of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which we've heard a bit about from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. But I wanted to get your reaction to that speech. What'd you make of it?
Yeah, I think the speech overall, if you watch the delivery and then you read it, it seems at first glance to be almost schizophrenic. The beginning of it talks about the history of U.S. engagement with Asia and long-standing commitment, and it could have been written by any administration because it looks at the historical broad approach to U.S. policy, and U.S. Asia policy is pretty bipartisan on that score. But then you had the second part of the speech, which then devolved into this America First rhetoric, particularly focused on trade and very narrowly on the problems and challenges of U.S. policy. And then I think that some folks who had expected that this might be some kind of broad Asia-Pacific vision that would also include things like security, the rules-based order, were expecting Trump to maybe delve into other aspects of policy, but then the speech just ended. And and I think some people were a bit concerned as to why there was no resolution between those two aspects. And I think if you take that and the presentation of the speech as sort of an indicator for what policy is, which I think a lot of people in Asia are doing, you don't get a clear sense of where this administration is coming out yet, in terms of this resolution between, Asia being the priority for the United States, but then also, this America First vision that still sort of dominates the discussion. I also think, by not including this and making this a more wide-ranging speech, and I understand, this is an APEC gathering, it did make it look more jarring, because if you look at the security side, as we've discussed before, there's a lot more continuity there with respect to some of the Obama administration policies. But because the focus was on trade and it was APEC, the contradiction there was quite glaring. So I thought in terms of the optics, that was really the problem that he was grappling with in the speech. I don't think that people were expecting anything significantly different, and he was a little bit conciliatory, at least to Vietnam, the host nation, and the Vietnamese were very worried, understandably, when Trump was going to come in, because they were wondering what he was going to say. So at least on Vietnam, I think he acknowledged the fact that Vietnam had developed, had been very successful, prosperous, and the bilateral meeting with the Vietnamese went pretty well. A lot of the statement was similar to the statement that was issued when the Vietnamese prime minister came over here, so not a lot of substantive changes again. But I thought that was what stuck out to most people, the sort of contradictions in the speech.
Well, there was that great sales pitch on missile defense to Vietnam, which I found incredible. You look at in 2016, you have the lifting of the lethal arms embargo, and then a year later you have a U.S. president pitching, Patriot missile defense systems to the Vietnamese. Who could have imagined that a year ago? But here we are. On the speech, Prashant, I think you're absolutely right about that contradiction. I had kind of, I think I raised this on a few podcasts ago when we were talking about this free and open Indo-Pacific idea briefly. But I'd almost wondered if this was going to be the opportunity for the United States to unveil something of a concerted strategy repudiating One Belt, One Road. We've seen sort of hints of that come out from the administration, Mattis being the most explicit during a congressional testimony when he said, Asia has plenty of room for many belts and many roads. One country shouldn't be able to say one belt, one road, which was by far the most explicit. Tillerson, again, hit on that a bit in his speech about India policy in D.C. in October. Trump, he didn't really get to it in the speech. He did actually use the expression many roads right towards the end, which I thought was an interesting nod towards this idea. But really, I think when you look at, the raison d'etre for APEC and you have this speech being given to a group of APEC CEOs, it really couldn't be more jarring. I think it is slightly overplayed, this headline you're seeing that, everything Trump did on the Asia trip was a massive gift to China when it comes to regional leadership. No, I think, people are maybe being a little bit too credulous and taking Chinese rhetoric at face value instead of looking at Chinese actions in the region, certainly. But I think, when it comes to that APEC speech, it's really a jarring difference. With especially the previous administration. We talked about the pivot and the rebalance quite a bit, and it was always worth stating that the pivot was never just about rebalancing military forces to Asia. It was always the second leg of the pivot, so to speak, was always the economic angle, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which obviously we all know how that ended up. And actually, that reminds me, if anything, one of the most significant events during this Asia trip was the supposed deal on, in principle, on the TPP-11, the fate of that agreement without the United States, with the idea being that the U.S. might one day end up changing course and joining the agreement. But really, everything we see here, it's really, there is a lot of continuity on the military side, as you said, but really the economic side is so different. And I think to a lot of Asian states, it does look like a form of retrenchment, because at the end of the day, there is demand in Asia for integration, connectivity, trade liberalization, multilateral trade deals. And I think that's something that this administration simply is unwilling to accept at this point. Well, let's, take this down a little bit now to Manila in the Philippines, the last destination on Trump's trip. And this, obviously, Manila was the site of quite a bit of activity. We had the entire range of ASEAN summits, the bilaterals on the sidelines, the trilaterals on the sidelines, and of course, the quadrilateral on the sideline this year between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, the four democracies with enduring interests in the regional rules-based order in Asia. And we had Trump's bilateral meeting with Duterte, the long anticipated meeting of the two strongmen, and of course the East Asia Summit. And Trump ended up leaving the plenary session. He wasn't in attendance, but we did actually get a glimpse at his prepared remarks, which I thought were interesting. Especially it included a bit on the South China Sea, which was something that had been missing in the presidential rhetoric throughout the trip. So that was unfortunate. It would have been an opportunity for the administration to at least show that the South China Sea still commanded U.S. attention at the highest levels of government, especially as we've seen, an expanded freedom of navigation operation tempo at the hands of Pacific Command, but just having the White House give some imprimatur to those operations would have been a positive, in my opinion. But let's take a step back to the ASEAN stuff. So you're the ASEAN guy. Give us a sense of how you thought everything went down.
Yeah, so I think with the ASEAN stuff, you touched on this with the Vietnam visit too. It's really important for us to emphasize to listeners too that while Trump and his visit was important, there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the region that doesn't necessarily involve the United States, and I think that was very much a center of activity there too. TPP-11 was a great example of that, as you pointed out. But also, it's the 20th anniversary of ASEAN Plus 3. So you had the ASEAN nations with China, South Korea, and Japan do meetings on that to commemorate that anniversary. So that's sort of a form of regional economic integration as well. You had the ASEAN states among themselves issue a couple of declarations on cyber and terrorism, which are kind of the two main threats now in the region that are getting greater focus. So that was on the ASEAN side. I do think on Trump and Duterte, which kind of was eventually unsurprisingly the big awaited summit meeting that people have been talking about. We mentioned this in the last episode too. I mean, the state of the U.S.-Philippine relationship was already quite good even before Trump made the visit. In fact, officials on both sides were worried about the implications of both leaders meeting because there might be an off-the-cuff remark that could, sort of derail the cooperation that was already ongoing. Both leaders managed to avoid that, and the joint statement was fairly boilerplate. A lot of the things that we expected that were happening already were enshrined in them. No surprises there. But there was that remark that Duterte made about journalists, being spies, and
Right.
Trump sort of chuckling. And unfortunately, that, as many people feared, did end up forming part of the headline and the narrative of the visit, which is that, Trump really doesn't care about human rights, and given what's going on in the Philippines, and also, by the way, human rights and democracy were not a major focus of the trip. And I think that's a lot of the negative press coverage that came out of the Philippine visit. But the relationship between the two leaders, it remains to be good. I mean, they had a phone call. It was, a bit controversial in terms of the details that Trump disclosed during that phone call. But even the bilateral meeting, I mean, they have a natural relationship in terms of being very frank, straightforward, keeping meetings short, keeping things crisp, and then leaving their bureaucrats at the working level to sort things out, and that suits the bureaucrats just fine too. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, the divergent reports between Malacanang and the White House on human rights, who said what.
Yep.
It was really just I think it really, I think, punched up the normative angle to the whole visit. Really, it was noticeable that, again, in China, I think a lot of activists have been hoping that the United States would make a case on behalf of deceased Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo on behalf of his widow. But Trump at the end of the day ended up making the case for a few UCLA basketball players, I believe, who had been arrested for shoplifting in China. I mean, it just made I think it just highlighted to me, at least, just the missing normative angle that I think it's not always welcome when the United States goes abroad and is seen as lecturing on human rights, and certainly in Southeast Asia, it's been a sore point in the past. But I think at this moment, it would have been certainly a welcome development. And you did have contrasts. You had, for example, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau making his case on behalf of the Rohingya, for example. But I think that episode with Duterte did punch that up a bit in the headlines, I thought.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the to your point about the South China Sea, I mean, you did see, at least rhetorically, the sort of movement to a code of conduct, and the Chinese and the ASEAN states did sign this sort of declaration about environmental management for the next decade. So I think the Chinese perceive too that with the Americans not having gotten their act together, they need to at least appear like they're managing this issue well, even if they get gains on the economic side, like One Belt, One Road, just so that then dampens the case for why the United States should be more interventionist on this question. The Chinese can say we're managing that well. So that I think is another trend that's worth monitoring on the South China Sea. I mean, it isn't much, as we've discussed before. So many problems with this so-called framework for the code of conduct, and the real issue is really going to be what Chinese intentions and actions are going to be in the South China Sea, and those are really worrying. But I do think that the Chinese are still making this sort of charm offensive push with ASEAN states, and that with Singapore's chairmanship next year is going to be interesting as well, because they have to manage this next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there was that weird aside from Trump that he would mediate the South China Sea, which I think, it was a good thing that people didn't make too much of that, because I really think that was just an off-the-cuff comment. It's not as far as I understand, it's not any sort of considered policy position of the United States, which again remains fairly static with what the Obama administration ended up leaving office with. I don't think anybody really knows what the next step for the United States will be in the South China Sea, apart from a stepped-up pace of freedom of navigation operations, which is what we've seen.
Yep.
All right, you want to talk a bit about the Quad?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the Quad. The Quad is interesting. It's something I actually have spent. I think I first came across the Quad almost 8 or 9 years ago, studying it in the context of the convergence between India and Japan. It's a fascinating idea. It was originally coined by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe during his first term in office back in 2006, 2007, when he was just in office for a year. He had to step down amid a personal sickness, but it was an interesting idea. The idea was that as a rising China appears on the horizon in the Asia Pacific, that the three middle power democracies, Japan, Australia, and India, would come together with the regional hegemon, the United States, also a democracy, to forge a like-minded forum. And it was really a forum. I think the Quad has been overstated. It is not an alliance. It is not any sort of well-defined organization with commitments. There is no, this isn't like the BRICS. There's no development bank. There's no capital being pooled together. And in fact, I think it's really worth emphasizing that the meeting that took place that generated all these headlines on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit took place at the working level. I mean, these were, senior diplomats, but again, this is below the level of ministers. Certainly, we're a while away from a leaders summit between the leaders of these four countries. I think and it was primarily, again, a result of Japanese initiative. Shinzo Abe, after winning the snap election, thought that this would be a productive way to spend, this upcoming bout of summitry in Asia. And this meeting that took place, there were a few themes that all agreed on. Really came down to this idea of preserving a free and open Indo-Pacific, a rules-based order in Asia, supporting freedom of navigation, opposing terrorism, opposing proliferation, expressing concern about North Korea, maritime security cooperation. But nobody really knows where the Quad is going at this point. I think the reconvening of the Quad sends a message. It suggests that these countries are indeed, again, like they were in 2006, 2007, concerned about the rise of China. But there really isn't an answer yet to how they will, I don't want to say counter, because that, again, I think pushes this narrative that this is really a coming together of states to push back China, to reduce space for China. But really, I think they're, they indicated with this meeting that they stand for an alternative vision, a status quoist vision. But the problem is, a lot of China's success has been in spite of the status quo. When these countries come together in the form of the Quad, they're not really proposing an alternative, because the alternative that they are posing is the status quo that a lot of these states have ultimately found less attractive than China's sort of no strings attached, very alluring approach of simply offering up capital, which may or may not be outlaid, but certainly makes for good headlines for regional leaders when they're able to announce spectacular multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deals. But again, there is a lot of promise here, and this is really a first step. I think that's worth emphasizing. Geopolitically, it may or may not be a game changer. It certainly won't lead to any sort of military alliance. I just don't think that the temperament is there. Certainly not there in India or Australia. Japan, again, remains hamstrung by its constitutional limitations, and even Indo-Japanese military cooperation has been hard won over the past decade or so. So that's sort of my take on the Quad. I know, you've also written about this trilateral, quadrilateral trend across Asia, and we've talked about it before, Prashant. What's your impression of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to caution about making too much out of it because it's still in the early stages, and also, as you correctly noted, there is no real formal infrastructure for the Quad, and anytime you get past the bilateral stage, you move on to trilaterals and quadrilaterals. As you get on more members, there's always a risk that this is going to end up fracturing, right? Because you need the leaders to really put the impetus for this broad coalition of states, but then you also need it to be sustained at the working level on a regular basis. And the way that strategic dynamics change in the Asia Pacific, as well as leaders in the Asia Pacific, it's really hard to get that alignment between these countries. I think we're definitely at that stage now where we could see more action on that. But what's been interesting though is you're seeing at the official level, and folks have been cautioning about the fact that this can't only be about security issues. So that a lot of the agenda that you mentioned, non-proliferation, maritime security, and some of these challenges, those are the easy things to do. I mean, you could have a Quad with an exercise schedule and these countries doing anything from humanitarian assistance and disaster relief exercises or maritime security, but you need to make sure that that's balanced to address this notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific to also include things like, in some of the trilaterals, they've talked about women's empowerment as being one issue where they could work together on. On the economic side, how can you get financing involved? And you saw on Trump's Japan leg some initiation of that. But the problem is, a lot of the stuff in terms of sharing common goals with democracies, these are things that they share in terms of a general commitment to. But when you get down to specifics, it's really hard, right?
Right.
The Indians, are not known for their chops on free trade, right? I mean,
right. Putting it lightly.
Yeah, exactly. So, and on democracy and human rights, the Japanese have a very different way about talking about that than the United States does, or even India does. So it's really tough to find that alignment to make sure that it's not only comfortable for all sides, but that it's broad-based enough to not be seen as only about China. Clearly, this is partly about China and about the regional order, and that's fine. But making it broad-based enough to sustain multiple administrations for a long period of time, I think, is going to be the interesting part of that. But I know, both of us have been looking at the Quad for a long time now, and it's definitely exciting to see some movement on that front, especially early on in the Trump administration. Certainly very promising on that front.
Absolutely. No, I think this idea that you just discussed is super important. I mean, look, if we talk about actionable things that the Quad will do, I think the low-hanging fruit is to quadrilateralize Malabar, or maybe not even quadrilateralize, but just invite the Australian Navy to participate next year. I can totally see that happening. Yep. It's a quick and easy deliverable. I think even the Indians are down to do it now after Doklam this summer. In fact, I think a lot of the enthusiasm you've seen, especially in the Indian media, it was remarkable. You have a working level meeting on the sidelines of an ASEAN summit, and it's front page news on almost every major Indian newspaper. There is great enthusiasm in New Delhi about this, and I think the security deliverables to me again do seem easier. It's that other side of the equation. It's how do you counter the Belt and Road that right. I think these countries will have to do a little work to figure out, and they may ultimately decide that this will ultimately end up being about security. All right, so to wrap this up, let's just very briefly talk about the East Asia Summit, and here I guess we won't be talking about Trump much since he did attend the dinner, but ended up taking off a little bit early. Did you manage to catch his prepared remarks, which he shared with reporters on Air Force One?
Yep, I did.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah. It was, on the South China Sea, which I talked about a bit before, it really shows that there's been, little policy movement. It's been effectively static. On North Korea, it's interesting that the United States still pursues comprehensive, a complete, verifiable, and total disarmament instead of irreversible. I don't know if that's a Trumpism again or a policy move. It's appeared in his prepared remarks twice now. So part of me wonders that it's some sort of strange policy move, but I'm not sure exactly what it might mean. But there was this debate about Trump not attending EAS. And EAS has, at least in the Obama years, came to symbolize one of the major ways the administration was showing that it would be a Pacific-oriented, Asia-first foreign policy team, thinking about this region above sort of the Middle East, where Americans had grown fatigued. And for Trump to skip EAS, there's certainly the optics of that, I think, are again not great, especially in light of a lot of the mixed messaging we saw on this trip. But do you really think that this is as big of a deal as people are making it out to be, or do you think that maybe this won't be the end of the world for the administration on Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhere in between. I mean, I think other presidents have missed EAS before, so this is not something that is out of the ordinary. But this is not an ordinary administration either. So the fact that this is the Trump's first year in office, there are already questions about multilateralism. This is ASEAN's 50th anniversary, 40th anniversary of U.S.-ASEAN ties, and so much uncertainty already about the administration. And the fact that staying there would have been an extra 24 hours, not even, that is a worrying sign. And you saw that play out on the front pages, and certainly it's not very reassuring in that regard. Now, I don't know if he stayed, whether it would have made much of a difference, because he stayed for most of the gatherings. Most of it was in terms of the significance and substance that was accomplished. But I do think, that there is this sense. I mean, the United States pushed quite hard after a debate in the Obama administration to get ASEAN to admit the United States into the EAS. There was a long, drawn-out process. And the process of scheduling so that the U.S. president can be there is a significant process in and of itself. And the United States, under the later stages of the Obama administration, was making all this effort to say that the EAS needed to be more action-oriented. And I think, anytime you're trying to make changes to an organization, it helps to be there for all of its deliberations. And if you're not, that significantly undermines your message.
Absolutely. Well, I think my bottom line on this Asia trip is it could have been worse. It wasn't great. It wasn't a total disaster. Important things that needed to be done, for example, reassuring Seoul and Tokyo at a time of an unforeseen level of threat from North Korea, I think went off fairly well as could be. Elsewhere, I think there was plenty of room for improvement, but nothing really appeared to fall off a cliff. I think a lot of this is still going to be maybe regarded in a few years' time as the United States sort of shooting itself in the foot, especially when it comes to multilateral trade and TPP and a few things like that. But I think the bottom line is that things could have gone a lot worse. What about yours?
Yeah, and the North Koreans didn't launch a missile, so
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you is that your take too, or do you have a variation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely the case. I think you could argue that there were a number of missed opportunities for the visit. I think one was, and I think maybe falsely so, people in the region were expecting a more sort of comprehensive rollout of a strategy. But the fact is, as you and I have talked about this before, you have so little senior officials confirmed in the Trump administration to carry out actual policy. And the fact that even an organized administration like Obama's took 2 years to roll out the pivot or rebalance, I'm not surprised that administration is not there. And as Lee Hsien Loong hinted when he was here at CFR and he gave an address, he was like, essentially, now may not be the time for really ambitious initiatives for the Trump administration to do in terms of trade. It might just be a time for all of us to take a deep breath and sort of sort out things before we aim for grander objectives and initiatives. And I think that's something worth keeping in mind too, as folks think about, do we want the Trump administration to unveil their big Asia strategy? Are you going to actually like what you see? Because I'm not sure that that's the case so far.
Absolutely. And, I guess to end maybe this on a note of optimism for folks who may be a little worried about the United States falling off a cliff in Asia. I mean, there is, again, we talk a lot about the rise of China and, Xi Jinping's power consolidation, but it's far from assured that China is so competent and so excellent at foreign policy that will that it will manage to outplay the United States at every turn. There's plenty that China can do on its own accord to undermine its own interests in Asia, just as the United States might be doing to itself. So really, at the end of the day, it's still an open question, where things are headed in Asia. And look, I mean, a lot of this diplomacy and strategic stuff in Asia is quite difficult, as I think the Obama administration found out amply, certainly between 2014 and 2016.
Yeah, and it also is the case that you do find that, at least in the recent administrations, U.S. policy on China does tend to start out soft at first, but does get progressively harder over time.
Absolutely.
So that's definitely something that we could see if the Chinese try to, Xi mentioned at the Party Congress consolidating China's role in the world. If that's going to include South China Sea and Taiwan, you can be sure that the United States will be responding to that as well. So.
Absolutely. Well, Prashant, I really enjoyed that conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Yep, good to be with you.
Great. And for listeners, just a note, this will be the last podcast for a few weeks because I will actually be on vacation in South Asia, and hopefully I'll have some impressions from that trip when I come back. But expect the next podcast to come out sometime in early December. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed, please do so you can keep up with that future episode when it comes out in a while. And if you have been subscribed but you haven't left us a review yet on iTunes, please do so. It really helps get the name out of the show. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.